joining the session. I hope you are enjoying all the sessions that are happening too far. Okay. You heard a lot of talks from experts about how to build agents. I'm also going to present our work on how we develop an agentic solution. Especially, we use the fine-tuned small models in enabling business leaders for an enterprise decision making. How many of you here know about pharma industry? Can you raise your hands? Okay. We developed this solution for a pharma industry. Mainly, you know, right, what pharma companies will do. They produce drugs to cure diseases. There are many groups involved in bringing a drug to a market. R&D department which focus on identifying the right molecule to bind to the target, either a protein in the body, so that it will cure the disease. And clinical division focus on testing this molecule in clinical trials to find out the efficacy and the safety of a drug. Once the drug is approved by a regulatory body, then the commercial division focus on launching the drug and ensuring it is reaching the right patient at the right time. So these are the different groups which are involved in bringing a drug to a market. While doing this process, the pharma companies will generate terabytes of data. So now the important thing that we want to solve here is that how can we enable business leaders to leverage this data for a efficient business making. Traditionally, business leaders will leverage dashboards to understand the business KPIs. If they want to know more details about a specific KPI, they need to rely on the data analysts who will process the data and provide the information back to the business leaders. So what is the challenge in this process? So the data analysts who are focusing on the primary task, now they have to deviate from the primary task and need to work on generating the reports and provide to the business leaders. But there is a significant delay in getting the business insights, because of which business leaders are not able to take the right decision at the right time. So our goal is that how can we enable business leaders to make a right decision by reducing the time to insight. As you can see here, an enterprise contains different types of data sources and different data systems. It can be unstructured data, unstructured data. We have built a solution so that it can provide solution both from structured and unstructured data. But for this presentation, my focus is more on how can we enable agentic system to generate the responses more from the structured databases. Okay, one of the important things that we did when we understood what is the business goal that we want to achieve is that we conducted the discovery workshops and we created a quick POC and we gave it to the business users and the analysts to start interacting with the system. Our goal is to understand how the business users interacting with the system and what they want to get from the system. In parallel, we also have analyzed the historical databases to understand what type of queries were executed on the databases. We have leveraged design thinking approach, which mainly talks about when you want to solve a problem, keep the user in the center and understand what are the pain points that he wants you to solve. So here also we did the same thing. When we gave this POC bot to the business user, they start interacting with the system. We understood, generally we thought that users will ask a question which will get an information directly from a database. But what we understood is that they started with a simple question. When they look at the result, they are asking a follow-up question. That means it tells us that you need to store the intermediate state of the results to produce the responses to the subsequent question. Another important aspect is that when a business user asking a question, they are not sure that how the results were produced. So they want to know that how each step is produced to get the final answer. Third aspect is that when we look at the enterprise data sets, we figured out there are a lot of domains and subdomains with thousands of tables across these groups. And the final thing is that this is a major challenge. So most of the times, database schemas are required to generate the right SQL statement. But in our case, we figured out these schemas are very noisy. So these are the challenges that we identified as part of the discovery workshop. and we have listed out the business features that we want to develop as part of the solution. So I will talk about how do we address all these problems. Before we jump into the solution approach, so the first thing what we did is that we identified what are the business metrics and the solution metrics that we want to achieve. So as you can see here, these are the various solution metrics that we want to achieve. Obviously, a system should produce highly accurate solution. And second thing is that reliability. Reliability is very, very key. See, here, when you ask a question, if you get an answer, even a slight change in the question should not produce a different answer, because this is more of a numerical answer that you are providing to the business user. So your system should be reliable when even if you ask the same question 10 times, it should produce the same result. And third thing is that instead of creating a black box system, you need to ensure you provide explanation to the every step that you followed while generating the response. And of course, the below two, cost is always produce a system with low cost and low latency. But when we are developing a solution, what we did is that among all these metrics, we prioritize the top 3 metrics in the initial phases, and subsequently we try to focus on the below 2 metrics to reduce the cost and latency. Okay, now we identified the metrics. The next step is that how can we design a solution to meet those metrics. One of the important aspects that we figured out is that when you are developing these kind of solutions, you have multiple components that are involved in the solution. Each of the component, there is a probability that you generate the error, right? So this error, if you are propagating from one component to the other component, the quality of your final output will be reduced. So our thought process is that how can we reduce the error mitigation so that your end results will be much better. So for that, we followed these steps. We want to build a decoupling system. So I will talk more about what decoupling here means. We want to create a separate planning and execution modules so that each of them work independently. And in each of these modules, we incorporated a self-reflection mechanism so that it will evaluate before the error is propagated to the next component. That means at each stage, we are trying to reduce the error rate. That way, we want to build a more accurate system. Third important aspect is that since it's an enterprise-grade system, we want to build the reusable components. It's not that you are building a system and if you want to solve another use case, you need to start from the scratch. So all the modules, whatever we have developed, these are all reusable across multiple use cases in the enterprise. And the last important point, this is more important for us. We want to build a system which should continuously learn from the type of successes that it is able to achieve, and it also learns from its own mistakes. To achieve all these design principles, we have chosen an approach of compound AI. What does it mean? Instead of relying on a single technology, we have used the combination of these technologies like agentic AI to achieve the goals, and we have used the fine-tuned small language models to perform the task, and we have also incorporated the traditional AI like NER detection and other models as part of the solution aspect. As I mentioned, we have built a decoupled system. We have a separate planning module and we have a separate execution module. So this here, the planning module has the multiple components. Whenever user asks a question, if the question is complex, we are trying to decompose the question into the small queries. We are using the chain of thought techniques, and we are using the few short example from the long-term memory. That way, we are creating the initial plan. The plan will be evaluated by the evaluator, and based upon the historical information, it will identify whether this plan has enough details to proceed for the execution. As you can see in the example here, the evaluator will look at does the system is able to detect all the entities and the business references that were mentioned by the user. Right? If it is able to detect all of those and map it to the relevant business terminology, then the plan what we are generating is more accurate. If it is not able to identify any of those business terminology, it will get the further clarification from the user to create the revised plan. And the third important aspect here, as you can see here, the self-reflection component. It will look at the initial plan that was created and the improved plan. It will try to understand what worked really well and what didn't work at all well. And this information, the reflective text, we are storing in the long-term memory, which can be reused for responding to the future questions. So now coming to the execution module, all right, I will talk more about how we are actually generating this SQL. It also has the evaluator component. It will check the correctness of the SQL before it actually executing on a database. I will tell you more about what techniques we are using to evaluate it. And we have incorporated the self-reflection technique so that the error will not be propagated into the subsequent modules in the system. All the learnings by the system will be stored in the long-term database, and we are using few short example to generate a SQL statement. So this is another important aspect, as I mentioned earlier. You need to build a system which can it is learning and improving over a period of time, right? So our system is continuously learning, so it knows what are the past successes. When our user asks a question, if it is very similar to the existing question, it knows what technique it tried to build the plan and execute it, and it falls to replicate the same success. The more important aspect is that if you are trying to replicate the past, if you ask a similar question, you will get a similar answer. You will never get a new, different answer. Another important thing is that it's not only replicating the success, it tries to learn from the past mistakes, and that information will be stored in the long-term memory, and whenever a new question comes, it can be used to build a solution. And the metrics that you can see here, using this technique, over a period of time, we are able to achieve a first shot acceptance rate for generating the SQL from 20% to 70%. This is a major improvement in our solution approach. It took a lot of time. I will talk about those metrics, how long it took us to achieve these metrics, because of which we are able to reduce the cost of developing the solution. Second important aspect, the reliability. As I mentioned, when a business user asking a question, they want to hear the same response every time. Initially, the reliability of the system when we developed a POC is much lower, but after incorporating all these techniques, we are able to increase it to 90%. So, okay, one of the important aspects to generate the SQL statement is that you need to leverage the database schema to generate the right SQL statement. As I mentioned earlier, our schemas are noisy. They are not good enough for us to generate the right SQL statement. Instead of following a different approach of using LLMs and other techniques, we stick to the basics and we try to enrich the database schemas. Here what we did is that we leverage the support from the domain experts to enrich the table descriptions and the column descriptions for each of the schemas in our different domain. The second aspect what we did is that since these tables were built historically, there is a lot of documentation available. You can leverage this documentation and you can use LLM to enrich the table and the column description. And you can see few more techniques that we applied here. We did the data profiling for each of the important columns in the database. We understood the data characteristics and we enriched the column description with this information. And similarly, we have incorporated the primary keys, foreign keys, and the partition information. And you can see a sample schema that was represented here. With all this information, we are able to enrich the database schema with the right information so that we can construct a correct SQL statement. One more important thing which we did here is that we built a semantic layer which essentially contains all the business terminology that the business users are using. So here you can see an example. Abnormal blood pressure, right? So when a user asks like this, we don't know that what does abnormal blood pressure means. So there is a business rule which defines that what the corresponding value for this abnormality means. So whenever a user asks a question, when our system is able to detect these business terminologies, as you can see in the previous slide, and it tries to map with this rule, and this information will be enriched as part of the schema that we are sending to language model to generate the SQL statement. Okay, so here you can see that whenever a user asks a question, we are trying to detect the business entities and augment the query with the business entities, and then we are decomposing a query. And below you can see the evaluator agent, which will evaluate and check are there any unidentified, undetected business entities, and if there is ambiguity in the question. If it detects those, it will get the clarification from the user so that the process will be cyclic. And this will continue for a few iterations. So now you understood the business question, you augmented with the business information. The next step is that you need to identify the relevant schema for you to generate a SQL statement. As I mentioned, this is an enterprise with multiple business domains. So we have the many data catalogs. Our data catalogs were part of the business catalog, and from these hundreds or thousands of catalogs, how can we identify the relevant information to send it to the model to generate a SQL statement? Right? And as you know that when you are building identifying the relevant schema to generate a SQL statement, these are the three types of errors which many times we face, right? Identifying a wrong table, right, column or values. So now I will tell you that how did we overcome these issues. The first thing is that we have taken the entire schema information from all the database. I'm talking about the enriched schema. Whatever the enriched schema which we have done in the previous slide, we have taken that information. We used a fine-tuned embedding model. We are not using the out-of-box embedding model. We fine-tuned with the domain-specific information, and we stored in a vector database. When a user asks a new question, right, we are able to do a semantic mapping to filter out the right tables on the column. In case if there are duplicate information that was identified, we are using the historical query logs to identify for this user what is the frequently used column or table to generate the response. Right? And the next important thing aspect is that this is a very, very big challenge that we face, especially in our domain. As you can see in the example here, databases contain categorical values. There are multi-word categorical values, especially in the life sciences industry. So users may not represent every word that is required to filter on a right condition. So in such scenario, how do you construct a SQL query with the right filtering criteria? So this is where we followed a new technique. We look at the high cardinality categorical columns, and we index the data of those columns. We follow the two-stage approach. In the first stage, what we did is that we index the data using the hashing technique, where similar values will be hashed into one bucket, and from the millions of values, you can do a quick lookup and identify the hash which belongs to and get the minimum set of results. And in the stage 2, where we are doing the semantic match and the long word matching techniques to identify the relevant filtering criteria for our SQL statement generation. With this, we are able to identify the right table, right column, and right values to construct the SQL statement. So now, as you can see here, we are passing the user query and the relevant schema on few short example. Here also we fine-tuned a small language model to generate the SQL statement. As I mentioned, we are doing the post-processing technique. We are using the different Python libraries to validate the generated SQL is correct before actually executing on the SQL on the database. As you can see here, we can use a simple explain technique to identify the query plan before actually executing. One of the important aspects that we focus on the execution time of the SQL query, because these are ad hoc queries that were created, right? So generally, when you are building the reports, you optimize the query so that it runs more efficiently. So here also we look at the query execution time by looking at the explain statement. And in case if it takes much longer, we fine-tune an LLM model which will revise the SQL statement that it generated. Finally, when it executes on a database, if it detects an error, it will send to the error correction model. I will tell you about when we fine-tune an LLM model. Generally, you fine-tune a LLM model with the set of natural language questions and the SQL statement. Here we have gone a step ahead, and we also identified the set of failure conditions, and we have provided that along with the correct SQL statement. And our model knows that whenever we send an error prompt to it, it knows how to correct the SQL statement. Now you got the results for each of the sub-queries that the user asked. The next step is that how do you combine all these results and produce a visualization to the user. Here we use a code interpreter which is running in a sandbox environment, and it will take all the data frames and it will write a Python code to generate the visualizations. The final step, as I mentioned, for us the important thing is the explainability of the results. So we have got the results tabular, intermediate results, and we have got the visualizations, and we have converted into the text description. All of this information is displayed to the user along with what was the table used, column used, whether the value is an exact match or a approximate match. So that way, when a business leader is looking into the results, he don't have to rely on a data analyst to understand about it. He has every information in front of him to take a right business decision. And this is how our overall solution looks like. It has a query understanding module, and it has a planning module, execution module. As I mentioned, these are decoupled modules. Each has a self-reflection to reduce the error rate. And finally, we are displaying the results to the user. And our foundational components, we have used a model gateway because we are using multiple models to send the right query to the right model. And we have observability. Every step in this process will be logged so that there is a traceability of what has achieved. And governance is important. We are using business catalog so that right user can only access the right information. And as I mentioned, we have fine-tuned different small language models. We have used the name for detecting the NERs. We have used a simple model, but-based model, which is fine-tuned on our enterprise data. Similarly, for the SQL generation also, as I mentioned, we fine-tuned the model with user queries plus SQL. Not only this, we have also added the error information and the correct SQL statement so that it knows how to correct the error. And for embeddings also, we have fine-tuned the embedding model. And another important aspect that we have taken into care while developing the solution is that we have also provided guided experience to the user. They can also choose the right domain and table so that they get the more accurate results. As I mentioned, continuous learning is a key component of the solution approach. In the short term, all the information that the system agents have learned, they were kept in the long-term memory. But over a period of time, we are retraining, fine-tuning the model so that it will be embedded into the model itself. So this is how our scaling journey looks like. We quickly developed a POC, which took us a couple of weeks. And then we did a pilot project, and we launched it to 20 users in 3 months time frame. Our scaling journey took us 6 months. From 20 users to 700 users, it took us 6 months time to scale the solution. And currently, 70% of the users who are using the system are very happy with the results. As you can see here, when you are developing an enterprise scale solution like this, there are multiple dimensions that you can take care of, right? Like latency, cost, explainability, all these aspects. You cannot solve all these constraints in one go. So we have priorities, which of them we want to solve in the initial stages and which of them we want to solve in the later stages. As you can see in the screen below, that initially our system is more of static, but over a period of time we made it continuously learning, and instead of propagating the errors, we are able to use reflection technique to correct the errors at each stage itself. And our system is more explainable. It explains every step that you take to correct the final response. And our system is more reliable. And if you ask the same question, it will give you the same response every time. And we are also able to move from the commercial large models to the small models, which are fine-tuned our data set. It helped us to reduce the cost and latency as well. So this is how the results looks like. As you can see here, the important aspect to evaluate the system like this is that you need to have the ground truth data set. Right? As you can see here, we started with a set of 100 samples. These were taken based upon the patterns that we identified from analyzing the historical logs as a starting point. And subsequently, we have grown to 1,000 samples in our test data set. And as you can see on the right side, what we did is that we created the embeddings of the schemas, and we created the embeddings of the questions, and we figured out whether we are able to cover the entire knowledge that was represented in the system. And you can see the results. Our system is performing really well for the questions that were asked on a single database, and also simple questions that were asked on multiple databases. For the complex questions that were asked on multiple databases, that's where we stood at 70%. Overall, the system performance is at 87%. And this talks about our journey, right? As I mentioned, though we achieved 87% accuracy, the key aspect that we took here is that our initial focus is more on the schema enrichment and query understanding. That helped us to achieve 20% improvement in accuracy from the baseline performance. When we incorporated the self-reflection technique, we are able to achieve another 12% improvement in the performance. And when you can move from the commercial models to the small models, which are fine-tuned on our database, we are able to see a little increase in the performance, but more importantly, we are able to reduce the latency and cost of developing a solution. Yeah, that's all I want to present. I hope you like the
Thank you, Vijay. The floor is open for questions. If anyone has any questions.
Hi, Vijay. This side. Yeah, thanks for the session. Really insightful. Just have a question on how you are validating the results from the users. So you have moved it to the production, but then the users actually start using it. How are you validating whether those results are right?
So as I mentioned initially, our validated data set has only 100 questions, right? Over a period of time, we are able to add 1,000 questions, and these questions were coming from the actual question that were asked by the user.
Okay, but when some new user starts asking new questions, how are you validating those?
As you can see in the diagram on the right side, we know that whether this question is a new question or an existing question, right? We know the deviation from the set of questions that we're asking. And if it's very close to the existing question, and we don't have to incorporate into our ground truth data set. And we analyze how far away it is from the existing questions, and if it is completely new, and we'll start incorporating into the system.
Okay. And also, how are you increasing the adoption of this tool? Because when the new users starts coming, I mean, they have to resort to the new way of using this tool. How are you trying to increase that adoption?
Correct. It's a very, very important one. That's why I mentioned that when we roll out the system, it took us 6 months, right? So what the important thing that we did here is that we started incorporating the business users right from the beginning of the development. There were 20 users who are working with us, and we have created the user guides, and we have created the sample demos for them to understand how to use the system. It took us time from using the system. As I mentioned, we need to customize the UI and the workflow in a way that they don't see completely different from the way that they are using. And as I mentioned, business leaders earlier, they are not using this system. They are using the static dashboards, right? Now they can ask what they want in a natural language and still get the response.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Hi,
we have
Vijay.
one last question. Yeah. Yeah, Vijay.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Vijay. Thanks for the presentation. So my first question was, when you mentioned module, have you mentioned like it's a separate agent which connects to the SLM, and it's all a separate agent, is it?
Correct. Right. Each module has multiple agents, not just one agent. Right. I instead of representing in an agentic way, I represent it as a module because our core goal is we want to build a reusable system. And especially the NER models and other models which we have developed, they were used across multiple use cases in an enterprise.
Got it. Thank you. And one more question. When you mentioned continuous learning, so how do you measure the success, and how do you curate that to the models?
As I mentioned, as part of the planning phase, right? So planning phase for us, the important thing is that understand the business intent, what the user is asking, right? And if you are able to identify the business terminology, business intent, and if you are able to decompose the query, so we know that the plan is correct. Right? When you are executing the SQL statement, before execution, you generated an SQL statement. As I mentioned, you can use simple Python libraries to validate the syntactic information. Another important thing which we did is that we have got the query plan trace from the explain statement, which gives you the detailed steps, what were the tables chosen, what were the columns, the execution time, right? So if we know the standard execution time of some of these, right? If something is going beyond this, right? These are all Python logic that you can create so that it validates and asks the LLM to actually recorrect it. This is during the generation phase. While during the execution phase also, in case if there's an error in the execution, that error message, whatever we are getting from the database, that error message will be sent to the another fine-tuned model. Right? It has a SQL statement and the error message, and it looks at this error message and tries to correct the SQL statement. Because in database, for every error, you have the mapping code which you can use to understand what went wrong. Have you chosen a wrong table, wrong column, wrong value, wrong joins?
Yeah, totally understand. Like for syntactical error, that's fine. So for example, it had given a result, but the result was not expected as from the prompt, whatever the text has given. So how do you measure this and begin success rate? So you also mentioned after continuous learning, you have reached very good. Yeah.
True. We developed an UI where we are presenting all of this information, like the way I mentioned, right? The results, the intermediate steps, and the explanation to the users, and where users also can provide the feedback in terms of the response and the results that we have provided. That feedback was also incorporated into the learning process.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, we can take one last question in the front.
Anyway, this is the last session, right? I will be outside as well. We can discuss more. Sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that mentioned that you pass the schema description, but the schema is, and what happens when the schema is too big? For example, we deal with a huge schema, each of 200 tables and 20 views. So, I mean, how do you, what models do you use? Because we would face context window issue.
Correct. Exactly.
And open source are not so accurate in SQL generation. So, I mean, how do you manage that use case?
So two points, right? First thing, we fine-tune this open source model. We
Right.
fine-tune the Llama model on our data set. It helped us to get the better result. Second thing, we are not passing the big schema. As I mentioned here, we are doing the schema filtering. We are only sending the right columns, right table that were required to generate the response. How we are able to do that? As I mentioned, we are converting the entire catalog information into the embeddings. The previous, right, our enriched schema looks in this format. This was, we created into, converted into embeddings.
Yeah.
And that embeddings model was also fine-tuned on our data set.
Okay.
And we are keeping this in a vector store. Whenever users ask a question, we do a semantic similarity to figure out what is the right column and the right table. Right, and based upon it, we only get the required information to respond to the user question. In case if we found a similar information in two tables or two columns, right, that's where we are relying back on the historical queries to disambiguate which of them are.
So you also provide a documentation about the tables.
Correct. That's part of the schema.
Okay.
Right. It has a detailed information about what this table. Not only the description, it also has more of the descriptive analytics, like the what I can say, the distribution of the data. If it's a categorical values, low categorical values, we are directly incorporating it. For high categorical values, as I mentioned, right, we are doing a two-phase filtering. Sorry, where is that slide?
So you provide a detailed.
For high cardinality values, what we are doing is that we are indexing them using the bucketing technique, and we have two-stage filtering. In the stage one, it tries to use the LSH algorithm, locality sensitivity hashing algorithm, which from millions of values, it tries to narrow down to few tens of values. And then we are doing this semantic match and the BM25 match to figure out the relevant suitable value for this column.
Okay, what was the previous algorithm that you mentioned for filtering?
LSH.
LSH. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Vijay. That was a pretty insightful session, and all the best. Right now, it's 700 users, you said, right? 700 users in a pharmaceutical company with 50% of success rate. Yes, amazing. Yeah, thank you, Vijay. That was wonderful. Thank you for ending the second day of MLTS on a very, insightful note there.